So this was my first AWS bill. As you can see, 60 cents. Also, if you look at the timestamp, it seems like AWS likes to send billing statements at 1:30 in the morning, which feels quite appropriate. But this was my first AWS bill. And also, hi, my name is Elena. I founded and I lead engineering at Holopin, which is a digital badge platform. I've been building on AWS for probably almost 10 years now. And tonight, I want to tell you affectionately and a little bit honestly about how it's been going. This is a love story. It's 2017 or thereabouts. I'm at some hackathon in Edinburgh, maybe Glasgow. I don't remember what I was building. Don't ask me about it. But I built an application and I need to deploy it somewhere on the internet. And so someone said at the hackathon, probably at the peak of their Dunning-Kruger graph, as a new university student would be, they say, just use AWS, free tier is forever, you can just do it, deploy it, have it running in no time. So I go to the console and I see something like this. Now this is also in the age of Heroku, where you literally, you can just like run some sort of a CLI command and it's there. But anyway, I don't know what half of these things mean, and half is also being generous. But I do what any clueless person would do in such a situation. I find the two things that I do kind of recognize, which are EC2 and S3, and I go from there. Now, S3, that's a bucket. It's basically Imager for developers. So you put a thing in, it's on the internet, this is magic. I'm happy. The thing is now on the internet. EC2, as I understand at that point, is a computer, right? Because we're not carrying server racks in our backpacks all the time, and you have to serve your application from somewhere. So I use the launch wizard to provision a said computer. Now the question is, which computer? Because right now, there are about 47 options. In any case, at that point, there were probably a bit fewer. I pick one, I SSH into the node. I serve my application from port 80. I don't know any better at that point. And I also don't know what security groups are. That comes way later. But, the thing runs. And at the end of the month, I get a bill, 60 cents. Now, that was the meet cute. And I don't quite yet know that AWS is a platform. And I definitely don't know that I'm going to be spending the next decade, pretty much, of my life in this platform. And so I use a phrase that should probably never be used when talking about a cloud provider, but I am charmed. So after my initial hackathon experiences, the relationship gets real. And so that's what I call going steady. I recognize that you don't actually pick AWS. AWS normally picks you when you join a new company and an engineer suggests that, yo, we need to deploy some container somewhere, let's use Fargate. And then someone else reads up on Stack Overflow that actually, for our use case, we should just port everything into Lambdas. So now you're using Lambdas. But you nod, then now you have both Fargate and Lambdas. So the services all accumulate. And one day, you wake up and you realize that you have opinions about ECS versus EKS, and you realize, oh, we're a thing now. So here in the slide, you can see that AWS has 5 ways or 5 places where you can run a container. So there's ECS, there's EKS, there's Fargate, there's AppRunner, there's Beanstalk, which I don't know who wants to admit that they used it in 2018. Oh, brave. Brave.
AWS, that doesn't count.
Ah. Come on. But there are also more places where you can run a container. Lambda, kind of, if you don't mind the 15-minute timeout. There's Lightsail, there's EC2 if you just want to SSH into the box. There's EKS, which is so nice, I had to name it twice. And probably by the end of this talk, there will be 20 different other services where you can run a simple container. And I guess what nobody tells you about cloud platforms is that it's not about picking, just a tool or just a place where you can run your application or do whatever it wants you to do. It's sorting through all of the 15 or 20 or however many ones and then picking the one that actually fits your use case super narrowly. And then will continue to work for the next 20 years, which is ambitious, but we'll get there. Around this time, I also find out about reserved instances. So this is really the AWS service which feels the most like a relationship, because you purchase one, you commit for a year or for 3. Yeah. Then eventually, 6 months in or sometimes 12 months in, you're going through your costs and you realize oops. Oh yeah, we purchased that. And now it's a situationship. Then there's also CloudWatch. And the interesting thing about CloudWatch is I'd probably credit it to how I learned about what observability is, mainly because it was obscuring it so much. Because we have CloudWatch, then there's CloudTrail, which is somewhat related. But then CloudWatch itself has CloudWatch metrics. It has CloudWatch logs. But then that's not the only way that you can ship logs or collect logs, right? You can have S3 just collectors and from your applications, and then you can query that using your data lake, and none of it uses the same query languages, and it's all very confusing, and nothing interacts with each other. And so at this point, I realized that you don't actually learn CloudWatch, you more so survive it, and you continue building on it. So by the end of this era, really, I stopped saying that I'm going to build an application, I'm just going to throw it on AWS. It became more like, okay, I'm going to use these 11 AWS services with 3 IAM roles, and then I'll probably also write a Terraform module just to spice things up a little bit. And this is exactly where the relationship gets serious. The engagement, really, in any relationship is the moment where rules become visible. And so suddenly there's family to meet, and you figure out which is the uncle that you shouldn't annoy or bring up politics to. There's expectations on both sides. There's paperwork. And for me, that stage was Kubernetes. So this was circa 2021, maybe actually 2020 or so. I picked up a couple of Kubernetes jobs. So I was working with different Kubernetes tooling companies, KubeCost, Lape, which is a Rancher alternative. But essentially, it was for tooling companies that build products for people whose job is actually running clusters at scale. So naturally, when it came to AWS integrations, that was EKS. And this, I think, really is the era where I stop being a user of AWS and start being someone who has opinions. And those opinions are what keep me busy. In my professional opinion, since I was allowed to have opinions then, or I'm allowed to have opinions now, EKS really is, it's one thing. So you have two platforms. You have Kubernetes, if we consider it a platform. You have AWS, which is another platform. And then you have EKS, which is the seam between the two, where all the bugs occur, and everything lives there that you have to end up fixing. And that takes up most of your time. Here, I believe I was going to add a screenshot of running a simple application container on EKS, but I ran out of time. But I did leave a note to myself what I should be adding here, and then I decided to just leave it in because I felt like, that's probably quite descriptive of the frustration. So, in addition to just being able to deploy a container or run a container on EKS, you probably will have some sort of, I have a list somewhere. What do we have here? Anyway, a bunch of services. And so this is essentially the engagement. And you realize that the relationship has rules. So around this time, again, we're still in 2020, 2021, AWS releases Managed Prometheus. And not just Managed Prometheus, but also Managed Grafana, OpenSearch, which is forked Elasticsearch. Then there's Managed Workflows for Apache Airflow. Then there's some sort of a managed service for Flink, which used to be Kinesis Data Analytics before its name crisis. But there's a moment around that time, 2020, 2022, where AWS is releasing a lot of open source projects as its own services. And I don't really know how to feel about it. But eventually, I land on grateful. Because managing your own Prometheus is a job, and I like to do less of it. And then I started Holopin around 2022. Holopin is a digital badge platform. We issue digital badges. We integrate with GitHub, Discord, have an API. There's a lot of sort of additional integrations and tooling. And Holopin was really the first time where I had to design a relationship with AWS basically completely from scratch, instead of just inheriting one. And so this is what we currently run on AWS. There's more services there, but essentially there's Lambdas, there are EC2 boxes, there's S3, CloudFront, domain management, observability, all of that stuff. No EKS? Sometimes. There's IAM also, of course, because you have to be compliant. But I'm kind of using that as a punchline in a different slide, so I'm going to skip that for now. But anyway, this is the substance. But it's really only half of the substance, because the right answer for front end wasn't really just AWS, it was Vercel. And while it does feel a little heretical to say this at an AWS meeting, I will say it anyway, but this is essentially the marriage. So the marriage isn't understanding that AWS is going to do everything for you, but it's understanding that AWS does things that AWS is best at, and we have honest conversations about the rest, including conversations where developers can decide and can compromise on using Vercel for front-end deployments. That's a healthy relationship. Lambdas. Now, we do use a lot of Lambdas, and they are the right answer for a lot of the things we do, because a lot of the workloads are async and they're spiky. There's image generation, there's webhooks. until you learn its quirks. And so the first one that you see here is the 15-minute timeout. And if you've been on AWS long enough, and if you've used Lambdas, you know that this is quite a depressing graph when you recognize that the reason that you're getting so many outages and failures, and it correlates with a 15-minute cutoff, is simply the limitation of Lambdas. And it's annoying to realize that because it probably means that you're going to have to port your application to something else, whether that be Fargate or EC2, and it's just more work. You normally discover this in production, though. Now, the second quirk about Lambdas, which is particularly painful, there's a 6 megabyte size limit. I think there are probably ways to mitigate that now, but for a platform that needs to handle base64 encoded images, this is kind of a pain point. And so, yeah, eventually we fixed it with pre-signed S3 URLs, but when you're dealing with images, you'll probably never forget the number 6. And so this is really the marriage. We recognize that trade-offs are real. The workarounds can be a bit personal. Most of the time it's working, but only most of the time, which makes it the perfect time for the next chapter. Therapy. Therapy is what you do when a relationship is good, but you want to make it better. And so recently I started doing some consulting, basically because I missed touching infrastructure that scales very differently from Holopin's. And one of the projects that I got pulled into looked a little something like this. So this company runs their own data centers. There are about 15 of them. They have a lot of hardware, a lot of custom hardware as well. So something in between CPUs and GPUs and both combined. There's applications on both. There's databases, there's Kafka, there are a bunch of legacy systems, and none of it is AWS. So why am I talking about it? Well, AWS is actually the control plane for all of those 15 data centers. So, yeah. I tried to put together an architecture diagram, then I realized that it probably reveals too much. So I just resorted to picking up whatever was visible, and I didn't have to zoom in on the architecture diagram, basically, and ended up with something like this. But what you might not see here, or what might be somewhat obvious, is that aside from applications running on EC2, like business logic, there's also CI that runs on EC2 spot instances. There's also some secrets management that happens across AWS and also some of the on-prem architecture. Then there's logs, which are flowing into both physical drives and also CloudWatch. There is an identity layer, which is IAM. And then also, when a developer pushes code, there's a Lambda somewhere that triggers a deploy back down to a data center. And that's also all gated via VPCs and also VPNs. So this, I think, is the chapter, the most recent one, where I realized that AWS is probably not just a place to run things. But it sometimes can be the orchestration layer where you control everything. And it's the connective tissue between things that you'd never expect to see together. And so working on a system like this forced me to actually understand the AWS security model a little better as well. And by which I mean all of it and all at once. So in a system like this, imagine the simplest thing, which is EC2 instance reading a file from an S3 bucket. So to make that work, you need an IAM role. You need an EC2 instance profile, which is weirdly not the same thing as a role, because reasons. Then there's a trust policy. Then there's, of course, an IAM policy. Then, because we're in S3, we require a bucket policy. Then, now I finally know, security group, a VPC route to either the internet or a VPC endpoint. Now, if you are using a VPC endpoint, then you're probably also going to need a VPC endpoint policy. Then there's the instance metadata service, IMDS v2, because IMDS v1 is a touchy subject. And then also the operating system's own firewall. That also has to be open for the right traffic. So there's 10 different layers to read a single file. And this is also simplified. I think when I started my career, I would have looked at this and I would have said, yeah, this is way too much. We're over-engineering things and this is just a lot of friction. But I think what the consulting project taught me is that really it's more of a vocabulary that you learn as you learn about AWS. And so in a relationship, this is what therapy is, right? You go in thinking that rules are the problem, but you leave knowing that rules are the relationship. On the left-hand side there is my first AWS bill, 60 cents. On the right, you can see the system that I currently somewhat own. And I know that we started this saying that this is a love story. And I think I still stand by that. Because somehow, after a decade of NAT gateways and the access denied on IAM and Lambda timeouts, payload limits, 10,000 policies, a lot of JSON and a lot of YAML, I'm still here for it. And it's probably one of the only tools. I think calling it a tool is a disservice. It's a platform, really. But it's probably the only platform where I continue to learn things every week. And for an infrastructure person, that's basically the relationship. And that's the deal. You sign up to keep learning, and AWS signs up to keep being weird. And so you meet in the middle. Thank you.
Amazing talk. I think anyone who's used AWS for a while, it all comes back to pre-signed URLs at the end of the day. So we've got time for a few questions. So we've only got one microphone. Are you okay just to repeat the question back when you get it?
Absolutely.
It's not a question, but AWS released durable lambdas. They put it in AWS Summit last week.
If it's last week, that sounds exactly like AWS. Yeah, there's also a way to configure the was it about size limits or about timeouts? Timeouts, yeah. So it depends on how you implement it also with your app gateway, because that also comes with limitations. But yeah, that sounds cool. I'll check it out. Yes?
What happens when therapy doesn't work?
What happens if therapy doesn't work? This is an AWS meeting. I need to watch what I'm saying.
Try again.
You can get more therapy in the form of, I think they call it consultants or AWS support. I think ultimately, there are lots of different cloud platforms. You can also run everything on-prem, bare metal, if you so wish to. Yeah, I don't have an answer for that. I'm still going through the therapy phase, man. Like, I don't know.
Any other questions? I'm glad we didn't take the analogy to multi-cloud, because that could have been dodgy.
Again, not really a question, but more of a comment. I mean, I see AWS more like a shed full of random tools. You know, the idea that there's somehow a coherent architecture is, you're doing well if you've created that.
100%. So your comment was about the AWS feels like a bunch of tools just thrown together. I completely agree with that. I don't know whether to feel like it's becoming more of a product or less of a product. I want to say that we're moving towards it becoming more of a product, especially with all the, you know, there are, well, the entire development tool industry really is based on like one tool fixing another. And now when the competition is so fierce, there's a lot of dev tools that are fixing AWS problems. I do think that with every PR that AWS engineers push, it is becoming more and more coherent. But who knows? I'm still in the therapy phase.
I've got a quick question if no one else has. So you've been using AWS for a long time. I'm guessing there's at least a few people in here who are reasonably new to AWS. What sort of advice would you give them, you know, given your 10 years plus of experience for somebody starting now? What's the, you know, if you'd known then what you know now, what piece of advice would you give people?
Piece of advice for someone starting out with AWS. I think one of the core concepts and core things you're going to have to understand is identity and access management, honestly. That is something that is probably going to take the most time to learn. So I think that would be a subject, even though it's really boring. But that would be a subject to not ignore, because, sorry?
Networking as well.
Yes. Networking too, sure, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, any other last questions? Otherwise, thank you very, very much.